Good evening, welcome. I'm John. I'm the event director at Literati Bookstore in downtown Ann Arbor, Michigan. We're pleased to welcome Julian Sancton this evening in support of Madhouse at the End of the World in conversation with his dad, author Tom Sancton. Just a quick webinar overview for those of you who are just joining us. The chat is closed, but you may want to keep the chat window open during the event, as I will be dropping links to purchase Madhouse at the End of the World from Literati throughout our event. Of course, if you're also watching us later on YouTube, links to purchase books are available directly below me in the description. And there's also links to find out about upcoming events as well. If you're watching us live, you can use the Q&A feature on your toolbar to submit questions at any time. Please, whenever the spirit moves you, please feel free to submit questions. I will read a selection out loud at the conclusion of the conversation this evening. And as I mentioned as well, live transcription is available on your toolbar as well. As a reminder, you can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com to have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. But if you live in Southeast Michigan or the Ann Arbor area, our doors are now open to the public. And in lieu of a book purchase, we'd also ask that you consider a $5 donation to sustain our virtual programming. So whether you'd like to think of that as this week's or this month's or this year's subscription to our programming, you can make donations at literatibookstore.com/donation. Otherwise, we simply thank you for your attendance this evening or this morning or this afternoon, depending on when and where in the world you may be joining us. And now I'll introduce tonight's author and moderator. Julian Sancton has been an editor at Vanity Fair, Esquire, and Departures, and written for such publications as The New Yorker, Wired, and Playboy. He has reported from every continent, including Antarctica, which he first visited while researching this book. And Tom Sancton is journalist, author, and jazz musician. He currently divides his time between Paris and New Orleans, where he has taught creative writing and is currently a research professor at Tulane. As a journalist and author, Sancton has written extensively for such publications as Time, during a 22-year career as writer, editor, and foreign correspondent, Vanity Fair, Fortune, and Le Monde. He has also authored or co-authored 7 books, including his latest work, Sweet Land of Liberty, America in the Mind of the French Left, 1848 to 1871. And in April of next year, Dutton will publish The Last Baron, the Paris kidnapping that brought down a dynasty. They can't hear you, but they can sense it through the power of the internet. So please join me in welcoming Tom and Julian Sancton into your living rooms.
Thanks very much, John.
Thank you. I think a good place to start is this question of how we choose subjects. Julian, we're both writers. We both published books, and we've both been through that sometimes difficult period of casting about for the subject of a book. I've done it a few times more than you have, but it's never easy. Maybe we could start by having you kind of talk us through that process. How did you come on this subject, and how did you kind of develop it to the point where you thought you had a book in it?
Right. Well, I'd been casting about for years, probably about 10 years from the moment, growing up as the son of a writer. It's not like I had any choice. I've thought about other careers, but it just seemed like the obvious thing to do, not because there was any pressure, just because it was the one thing I sort of felt was that you showed me what it meant to be a writer, and it was something I wanted to do. So I'd been for about 10 years, 10, 12 years looking for a book subject and getting very excited about a few. Getting deep in research about them, and then realizing that there were very good reasons why those weren't the books for me. Either there wasn't enough primary source material, or there wasn't much of a market for it, or I was too green as a writer. I think when I discovered this story, it was at the perfect time, and I just, so many things worked my way. Everything fell in the right order, and it just worked out. So the way I discovered this is I was sitting at my desk at Departures magazine, and I was reading a article in the New Yorker that was talking about the NASA's plans to study the effects of long-term confinement and isolation in astronauts in preparation for manned missions to Mars. And that article began in classic New Yorker fashion by sort of backing into the story, where it included a summary of about 4 or 5 paragraphs of this expedition I'd never heard of. It was the first scientific expedition to the Antarctic. It was called the Belgica expedition, and named after the ship that carried it. And in those 5 paragraphs, it evoked these images that were just so alluring to me. This idea of people going mad in poles, as if there was some kind of malevolent force at the extremes of the earth that that made men go insane, and that brought to mind a book that you know well, that both you and my mother told me about from very early on, probably too early to tell a young impressionable child. But the book is Edgar Allan Poe's The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. Which is was written before anybody had even set eyes on Antarctica, and it was completely phantasmagorical, and yet there was something in this summary of the Belgica that summoned that in my mind, and then there was the idea that as much as the men suffered both physically and mentally, they were ultimately, or most of them were ultimately, saved because of the ingenious interventions of a man named Frederick Cook, who was the sole American on the expedition, and would later on be remembered as a charlatan, and was imprisoned for 10 years in Leavenworth Penitentiary, 7 years for Leavenworth Penitentiary, for running a Ponzi scheme. But in this case was a genuine hero. So I was also drawn to that idea of the heroic anti-hero, which for me is like Han Solo or Butch Cassidy or Sherlock Holmes, these men with tremendous flaws that are nonetheless heroic and charming and irresistible. So I had to that got me going. That got me curious. I actually called a friend of mine who is a screenwriter in LA, and I said, this is I thought of him first, weirdly. This is your next movie. You've got to write this. It's too perfect. And he says, well, in Hollywood these days, everything's got to be based on some kind of intellectual property. Nobody makes anything original anymore. So maybe if there were a book. And I looked, and sure enough, there wasn't. So that's how it started.
Yeah, it's interesting. You talk about growing up in a writer's household, and that's sort of determining your decision to be a writer. I hope I never pressured you to do that.
Never. No. And if you did, I wouldn't tell you.
But I grew up in a writer's household. My father, Tom Sancton Sr., was a journalist and novelist. And I remember when I was a kid going to bed. He had the only air-conditioned room in the house, so a lot of time I would go to sleep in his bed while he was typing all night. So the sound of the clattering typewriter is something that goes back almost as far as I have a memory. And that, the fact that my father was a writer certainly had something to do with my career path, although he didn't push me in that direction. In fact, he used to tell me, son, don't ever be a writer. He figured it was kind of a hard
romanticizing career. It, probably romanticizing the difficulty of it.
Yeah, but the interesting thing is that father-son relations have such a huge influence on men's lives.
Yeah.
Their career choices, their characters, their values, and it seems to me in the case of your book and your main characters, I know a little bit about the fathers and the background of your 3 main characters, but not a lot. So we were talking about Cook, Amundsen, and de Gerlache.
I'll fill in the story, but yeah.
But what can you tell us about their relationship with their fathers and how it affected their lives and careers?
Yeah, the story is the 3 men you mentioned are my main characters. Cook was the ship's surgeon, and also the savior of the expedition in many ways. Adrien de Gerlache was an aristocrat, a Belgian aristocrat, and a sailor which was an unusual thing for a Belgian to do. They didn't have much of a maritime tradition, and who conceived of this expedition and assembled it and set it into motion, who was probably not prepared for it, but definitely he dreamt bigger than he could achieve. And Amundsen was his other great staffing decision. De Gerlache did not make a lot of great decisions, but hiring Cook and Amundsen were two of the best ones he made. Roald Amundsen would become famous, who was the first mate of the Belgica. He would become famous later on for becoming the first man to reach the South Pole, and also the first man to blaze through the Northwest Passage, and also most likely the first man to the North Pole, which was a trifecta of polar exploration. When he joined the Belgica, he was only 25 years old, and there were three men that he looked up to who were, he had already set his mind on becoming a great explorer. And there were three men loomed large in his mind in setting him on that course. One was a man named John Franklin, who was the captain of the Terror and the Erebus expedition or the Franklin expedition, including the ships Terror and Erebus to the Northwest Passage in the 1840s, which ended in horror and tragedy when the ships were caught in the ice and they were and were crushed and all the men died. Another man who influenced Amundsen was Fridtjof Nansen, who was a great Norwegian explorer, a compatriot of his, who Amundsen had met early on, and he was just the closest thing there was to a Norwegian hero, a modern day Viking. The third was his own father, Jens Amundsen, who was not around for much of Amundsen's childhood. He was a ship captain, and many of the stories we know about him are told through Amundsen's eyes. He was only 14 when his father died, but he revered him. He was something of a war profiteer. Jens Amundsen had shipped arms during the Crimean War. He had also he traveled around the world. He had a axe scar from a mutiny when he was carrying Chinese prisoners, I believe, and there was a mutiny of the prisoners, and he had them hang their own leader, which he seems like a brutal man, and he died at sea. So all of these things are for some reason, Amundsen revered in all these men these qualities that we wouldn't normally aspire to. In Franklin, he revered his ability to withstand suffering, and in his own father, it's this inglorious, almost pirate-like career that he had, and for the rest of his life, he wanted to sort of live up to that glory, that almost storybook quality. For Cook's father died when he was very young. Cook was 5 years old when his father died. He was a German immigrant, as was his mother, and he changed the name from Koch, K-O-C-H, to Cook in the during the Civil War, at which point he was a surgeon as well. So Cook was born right after the Civil War. But it's likely that he saw many. He saw his father at work, amputating limbs, or doing many of the horrific things that were required of medical doctors at that time, and it's not. It's relevant to that Cook decided once he had to become the breadwinner of the family that he should pursue a medical career. And so he also, in that way, aspired to live up to his father. And his mother did pressure him to become a doctor, because I think Cook lived. That's the way in which Cook's father influenced him. And then de Gerlache, he was a bit of a mama's boy, but his father definitely coddled him and wanted and tried to discourage him from pursuing a career as a sailor, which he thought was beneath his station. Yet he, the father, who was a military man, tried to encourage him to become, to follow in his footsteps, and his, it was going down. Generations of de Gerlaches were military men. Yet de Gerlache himself, the Adrien, was a pacifist, and so he was miserable on land, happy only at sea, and happy only dreaming of being at sea. And eventually, his father relented and decided that if he's going to pursue this, no matter what I say, I might as well encourage it. He was a much more confident and confrontational man than his son was. And when the de Gerlache put together the expedition, he suspected that several of the people that he had hired, that the Belgian Geographic Society had imposed on him, were plants, and that they were going to take the expedition away from him. They had his father, he had his father do the dirty work and dig up dirt on this guy and get him fired. Yeah.
Well, you talk about Cook. It seems to me, I mean, he had such a huge role in this expedition. I mean, he really saved the expedition. We came up with you can explain how he helped free the ship when it was taken in the ice, and he found creative ways to deal with the problems, health problems and mental problems, psychological problems that were afflicting the crew. And it seems to me to continue with his father-son theme, that he was, although he's not that much older than most of the others, he seems like he was kind of the father figure of that expedition. Not the captain so much was the father, but it was really the doctor. It was Cook. Would you say?
I hadn't thought of it in those terms, but I absolutely do agree with that. He was 31 at the time. Was he? This was. Yeah, he would have been 31, 32, and no one on the ship was older than 35. Yeah, he was at his best when he had people to take care of. When it was in Brooklyn, it was his family, and the living in the streets of Brooklyn taught him how to hustle. That's where it also taught him how to become something of a petty criminal. And he built a milk distribution empire at the age of 16. When he went to the Arctic, even though he was very young, he also took care of people and saved them from terrible suffering. And then in the Antarctic, he treated the men like his children. I think and that's why he became the most beloved man on board. The commander himself, de Gerlache, was retiring. He was sensitive. He also was afflicted greatly by what you described, the scurvy, the this sort of mysterious polar ailment or malaise that made men disoriented, that caused brain fog. Anyway, he was sort of out of commission in a lot of ways. And one of the great interventions of Cook, aside from his medical prescriptions, aside from having the men eat penguin in order to stave off scurvy, which was actually quite ingenious, the thing that NASA, for example, learned the most from is his practice of conducting systematic psychological surveys of the men in quite a loving and warm way, and it made the men feel tended to. Even though if there was little he could do, at least he was listening to them. So in that sense, it's almost like being a psychologist, but it's also like being a parent. He had experience of this, and they didn't. And the one man who looked up to him as almost a father figure was Amundsen. At the end of Amundsen's life, after he had achieved more glory than he could imagine, and had been feted as the greatest polar explorer of all time, the one man he visited the one man he never abandoned, the one man he still looked up to, was Cook, and he was the only person to ever visit Cook in prison. And And at that time, Cook had aged beyond his 60 years, and Amundsen looked 20 years younger, and he held his hand the way one might hold the hand of a father, and had said that he had learned everything from him. So yeah, in that sense, it's true. Cook is very much a father figure. He became a father. He had two daughters when he came back from the Belgica expedition, but it does seem like the men of the Belgica were just as much his children.
Yeah, you know, the father figure, I mean, the father is the one you look to for answers, and when you're in trouble, you know, he's the one who he figures how to save the day, or give you advice, or guide you down the correct path. And Cook really did that. I mean, the real, you talked about dealing with the ailments and the scurvy and everything, but tell us about this ingenious idea he had for freeing this icebound boat.
Well,
through a second winter, and
the Belgica was the reason that they were in this predicament is because they had been stuck in the ice in February of 1898. It became clear as the winter ice was setting in that the expedition was not going to reach its original goal of the South Magnetic Pole, and de Gerlache made the baffling decision to sail into the pack to possibly to go as far south as possible before the ice set in and maybe set a record, but more than likely in order to have a harrowing story to tell when he got back home, which and stories are as valuable a resource as anything else in terms of polar exploration. That's what sells books. That's what gets the public excited. But it was a practically suicidal decision, and certainly had fatal consequences for some of the men on board. The ice held onto the ship for more than a year, and when 1899 came around, the summer had not shrunk the floe that held the Belgica. It was still more than a mile thick, and a mile wide, and as much as 28 feet thick. So the Cook was convinced, given the state of the men, that very few of them would survive a second winter, and it looked almost certain that they would be condemned to one if nothing happened. So he said, "Well, we have to leave. We have to find a way to leave." And this was this struck the other officers as a ludicrous proposition. It's as if he had suggested that they flap their wings and fly home. But it was the one time he lost his cool. He's always in total control, but this one time he blew his top, and he said that we have to do something, even if it's just to get the men exercise, even if it's to get them, give them some sense of agency, and so that they don't just give in to fate. And he concocted this wacky idea of digging a trench in the ice from the prow of the ship to the nearest body of water, about 700 meters away, and in hopes that the sun, which he had come to consider almost a deity, given if that's what 3 months of endless night will do to you, you become a sun worshiper. And he hoped that the heat of the sun would reach the bottom layer of this trench and weaken the ice along that line, so that if ever the floe did break, it would break along that line and the ship could escape. This was a poorly conceived plan. There's no reason to think that the water there would the water is like a waterbed, it would, or like a layer of water that would not stay contained along that line, even if it did heat up. So it was dictated by poor physics, but it really inspired the men and what inspired them was the passion with which he threw himself into the work. I think a lot about the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Yeah.
At the end of that, or actually in the middle of the movie, Jack Nicholson. I think you can hear your granddaughter there.
Yeah.
Yeah. At the end, Jack Nicholson, who's in this insane asylum, a good parallel for the Belgica. says it tries to rip out the sink from the floor and try to throw it through the throw it through the window as a way to escape. And it's obviously impossible, and nobody believes he'll do it. But he tries and he tries, and he strains himself, and he can't do it. And everybody just looks at him as he walks away, and he says, "Well, at least I tried." And that's exactly what Cook did. One second, this is embarrassing.
That's life, you know, his fathers and sons and his fathers and daughters.
Yeah, and so that inspired them to try. That inspired de Gerlache to try another plan. This one much more ambitious, to saw an actual canal. They thought, well, he saw how much good it did for the men to try this, to throw themselves into this work. So he decided to actually try to saw an actual canal that would require sawing through more than a mile's worth of ice that was at its thinnest a meter thick, with 3 dinky little saws that were left over from when this ship was a whaler in Norway. It was an absolutely it seemed absolutely doomed to fail, but it turned out to be a masterpiece of glacial engineering, and it ended up the men sawed every time they sawed they clear the canal, the banks would close because of the pressure of the ice, and they had to keep sawing. It became the Sisyphean task, but eventually it worked out. Yeah. And they got stuck again, but further north. What's that?
It did them a lot of good, though. It boosted their morale, and it built up their muscles and their
absolutely. Yeah,
fresh air, I guess.
We have grown ponderous muscles, and they said that our skin is now is the color of copper kettles. Yeah. Because they were working in the sun, and a lot of them got snow blindness too. But it was and it forced them to eat more than they had, especially, and the only food that they had at their disposal was penguin steaks. So that also helped clear the residual scurvy they might have had.
How does that work? Penguins? I thought it was limes and lemons and oranges.
Well, that's what de Gerlache thought as well. The scurvy was thought to have been a disease of the past. In the 19th century or in 18th century, a Scottish surgeon named James Lind had discovered that lemons cure scurvy. He didn't know that it was because lemons contained vitamin C, but the clinical data was irrefutable that lemons reversed the symptoms of scurvy, which, unless something was done, scurvy was deadly every single time. So throughout the 19th century, the Brits, the Royal Navy gave, and many other navies, but the Royal Navy sort of led the charge, gave their sailors regular helpings of lemon juice. And then when lemons became expensive, they would give them lime juice. And then when that became expensive, they would give them concentrated lime juice. But even though concentrated lime juice is really not a great remedy, it doesn't contain nearly enough vitamin C, the duration of ocean-going voyages had shrunk thanks to the steam engine, which sped up ocean travel. And so people thought scurvy had been conquered, and yet it hadn't. And that was in an Antarctic voyage like the Belgica, where they are stuck without any new provisions for months at a time, and without in an Antarctic, in a flow of ice thousands of miles from the nearest human being. It became evident that the lime juice that de Gerlache had brought along was not doing the trick. And so Cook was forced to improvise, which is something he did extraordinarily well. He thought back to his time among the Inuit in the Arctic, where he had traveled. He traveled to Greenland with Admiral Robert Peary, and it occurred to him that the Inuit, despite having a diet that consisted almost exclusively of meat, fresh game, did not suffer from scurvy. And so he thought there must be something in that diet or in that meat that reversed the effects of scurvy. And so he forced the men to eat penguin as raw as possible in the Inuit fashion. And the men who followed his advice, like Amundsen, who was the only person to express any taste for penguin meat, saw their symptoms disappear, and those who refused, like de Gerlache, who thought it was revolting and beneath his station as an aristocrat, just kept faring worse. And which is why during the breakout, during their escape from the ice, Penguin did them a lot of good and actually helped bring them back to health. Many of them, some there was not very little they could do. But yeah.
Well, your title talks about madhouse, and it's really more than just a kind of a metaphor. I think in some cases the people really did go mad. Tell us about the experience of one or two of the sailors who absolutely kind of lost their minds.
Well, there were a lot. All of them felt that they were at the brink of insanity. It was several of them described the Belgica as a madhouse, which is where I get the title from. But two showed signs of real psychosis. One was a Belgian man named Jan van Mierlo, who had at one point after the return of the sun, and which is the moment that everybody thought would make everybody start to feel better again and bring them out of their depression. That's actually the moment where the true insanity began. So he woke up one morning and gave handed a note to one of his shipmates that said, "I can't hear, I can't speak," which was chilling. But then this shipmate takes him to Cook, and Cook examines him and says that there's nothing wrong with his ears or his vocal cords, that it was his mind that had been affected. It took 3 days for him to recover his ability to speak. But once he did start speaking, all he could talk about was murdering his superior, which alarmed people even more, and he had to be watched 24 hours a day. He had only started to recover when an even more serious case showed itself. It was that of Adam Tollefson, a Belgian sailor who had actually had plenty of experience in the Arctic and so you can't ascribe it to sailing in the Arctic. You can't chalk it up to the cold or the dark. But he became incredibly paranoid. He would sleep. He was certain that his shipmates wanted to kill him, and he would avoid their company. He would sleep in the hold, inadequately dressed, among the rats. He would try to escape the ship. He had no memory of embarking on the ship. He talked about walking back to Belgium. He would mail letters to his fiancée back home by folding them up and putting them in a hummock of ice that looked to him like a mailbox. He would every time he passed his shipmates, he would bow his head as if to receive the chop of the axe. It's a really sad tale. He never recovered his reason. I tracked him down to after the Belgica. He had plenty of ideas of things he could do, but it was evident to everyone that he had just lost his mind. And so he was registered at an asylum in Leer, Oslo, which would become notorious for its use of experimental techniques like, speaking of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, lobotomy and electric shock treatment. So he actually lived longer than most people on the Belgica, and for the rest of his life he was registered there.
Wow. Well, that is quite a sad story. And when you look at all the harrowing experiences that the crew had, the kind of near-death experience. Well, I think a couple of them did die. Yeah. I look at that and I wonder what makes men kind of go to the end of the earth and put themselves in such a terrifying environment. What was the aim of that mission, and apart from just the official aim of the mission, what pushes men to go into these horrifying, forbidding corners of the world? Is it glory? Is it money?
Yeah. I begin I found a quote that I used as a what's the word, epigram? And at the beginning of the book, there's a famous quote by George Lee Mallory, who died trying to ascend Everest. And the quote is, why did you want to climb Everest? It's because it's there, which seems, it seems tautological, it seems circular, but there's no other real explanation for it. That something has not been reached, which means it has to be reached. But I begin the quote with another part. I tracked down that interview, and he said something else that was interesting, which is that sometimes science is the excuse for exploration. I think it is rarely the reason. And that was the case for the Belgica. It was de Gerlache presented it astutely as a scientific undertaking. There had never been a purely scientific expedition to the Antarctic, and at that time in the 19th century, science was cited as a justification for almost all kinds of exploration, and also for all colonial projects. It was cited alongside this notion of being a civilizing mission. On the one hand, for example, in the Congo, Leopold II, the king of Belgium, talked about that project as a civilizing mission, but also as a scientific one. And clearly that was a pretext. I think it was a pretext as well for de Gerlache, but one he was smart enough to take seriously and hire real scientists. For the scientists on board, it was who decided to go along and to Antarctica, to the which was a void at the bottom of the world. It was practically unknown. It was definitely, they knew the dangers, but I think they went along because it was such a great career move for them. It was, one of them didn't have a diploma, and so he considered the Belgica his diploma. But and several of the sailors joined in order to escape troubles back home. But for my three heroes, they all have a different idea of what glory means, and they were all driven by glory. There's no doubt. They were all driven by romance, by the stories they read as children, both narratives of polar exploration, but also fiction. I think they were almost more influenced by fiction than by these memoirs of polar explorers. So I think it's there's really no explaining why why do we need to go to Mars. We give all sorts of justifications, like, oh, we've ruined the planet, so we need to go, or we'll find some resources there, but really it's because it's there. I keep trying to find something less tautological, but there are just men, and not all of us are built this way. There's not everybody. I'm certainly not. I've got no desire to go into space, but there are certain men that just strive to reach the top of things, and Cook and Amundsen and de Gerlache were built that way, but only Cook and Amundsen had what it took.
Yeah. Men and women. I can't think of the name now, but there's a famous French sailor, woman, solo sailor, who's just went through harrowing experiences, lost her mast, and I wish I could think of her name, but I mean,
right.
to go around the globe solo, and so.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and also, I think you do well to mention that. I think that the American astronaut with the longest time in space is a woman, and so there's at this point, yes, I was speaking in the antiquated terms of the 19th century.
Yeah. It's funny. This is just a real aside, but you mentioned Leopold II and his motivation being
well, you dealt with him,
scientific. As a matter of fact, we had anybody who studied the history of the Congo knows it was an incredible land grab.
Yeah,
it was a very, very lucrative proposition, first from the ivory, and then this incredibly lucrative rubber trade, which wound up killing, well, according
millions,
to some
millions, according to Adam Huxtable,
10 million. Conscript or forced workers among the Congolese, and made Leopold, who was actually the personal owner of it wasn't a Belgian colony, it was his personal property, made him very, very, very wealthy. So the scientific kind of pretext. But
Well,
that
the funny
certainly
thing-
wasn't the case for the Belgica. There was no fortune at the end of that rainbow, was there?
Yeah, no, and that's what's so interesting about de Gerlache is he had actually been offered a chance to join this the Leopold's Congo project as to chart the river system, much like it would have put him in the same waters as Kurtz and Marlowe in Heart of Darkness.
Conrad, yeah.
A few years later, yeah, but he had no appetite for. Well, for freshwater navigation, for one thing, but also for colonialism. And when the king pointedly refused to back de Gerlache's expedition, even though it was framed as a national endeavor. And de Gerlache never forgot that, and he refused to name a land after him, which was common practice among explorers at that time. You name a land after your sovereign. And that's why we have Victoria Land, named by James Clark Ross, on the other side of the Atlantic. And more interestingly, he refused to lay any kind of territorial claim to Antarctica, which set him apart from everybody that came before, and many that came after. But I think, and I've argued this elsewhere, that this set a precedent of scientific internet, the scientific collaboration in the Antarctic, and peace, a standard of peace in the Antarctic, which still which abides today, and has in turn set an example for cooperation.
Fascinating. That's fascinating. Well, take us back to the end of this story, the end of this saga. They free the boat from the ice. They go back to Belgium. What happened? What was what kind of reception did they get? What was the result of this whole experience?
Everybody forgot that the Belgica failed at most of its aims. De Gerlache was a broken man at that point. He had not only suffered tremendously during the imprisonment in the ice, but he also had to sail. He didn't have money to pay the sailors, so he had to sail back solo, practically with a skeleton crew, this ship back to Europe, and confronted terrible winds. And so he was exhausted. He looked 10 years older than he was. He was 33 years old, and he looked like an old man, but he had this great story to tell. And he and his men had established, even though they were striving to reach a record latitude, or at least a record to reach the South Magnetic Pole, they had established another kind of record, which is that they survived an Antarctic winter. They proved that an Antarctic winter was survivable, which nobody knew. And he had a hero's welcome, and his mother and father embraced him, and the minister on board the ship, Leopold, arranged to have other plans that day, but the minister of the Interior who welcomed them said that the name de Gerlache has appeared many times in our history, but you not only do it justice, you've become the most famous of them. So that talk about Oedipal dynamics there. That certainly, he was. History remembers him now as for his questionable decision to sail into the ice, but at that time, in his lifetime, he was considered a hero, and I still think he was a hero in a lot of ways. But it was unambiguous then. But Cook and Amundsen went on to pursue their own dreams of glory in their own expeditions, and they did it in quite different ways. Cook, announced that he had reached the top of the summit of Denali, the tallest mountain in North America, and then announced 5 years later that he had reached the North Pole. He was feted for both. There were ticker tape parades and headlines all over the world, but it turns out that both were almost certainly fabrications. So he became a punchline. The only audiences who would take him seriously, or who would attend his lectures, were vaudeville, and he was condemned to federal prison. Amundsen, meanwhile, achieved the goals that I mentioned before, and so that's another dynamic, that the the father figure in Cook, as you mentioned, turns out to be this crook, and the figure of Amundsen, the son figure, ends up being the hero, but he had learned everything from Cook, and so there's nothing Oedipal in that. I didn't think of Cook as a father figure until you mentioned it, but I did think of the idea of the apprentice and the mentor having such different paths to be something irresistible, which is why I begin and end the book with their meeting in Leavenworth.
Yeah, no, that was very effective bookend, very moving. John, do you have any questions at this point, or should we continue our chat?
There are no questions currently, but if folks have any questions for Julian, they can use the Q&A feature that's on their toolbar to ask them. But Tom, okay, I'm happy to turn it back to you. I'm sure you have maybe a couple more questions.
Yeah, no, I wanted to point out, I didn't realize this until I saw, we've zoomed a while, but I never noticed this, but you have a Sancton bookshelf behind you, right? And then I've got one right here.
Oh, yeah.
Right there. And yeah, it's that was a big moment for me. To include Tom Sancton, your father's 2 novels, By Starlight and Count Roller Skates, and then you only have one of your books there, but I've got like 4 of them here.
Another one here.
Another one, yeah.
Song for My Fathers. Song for My Fathers.
That made me want to ask. I mean, what was it like to you talk about fatherhood in 2 different contexts, in that your fathers are it's plural. So what did your father is one of them, but tell me about that dynamic and what it was like writing about both your father, your biological and your spiritual fathers.
Well, Song for My Fathers is really it's a memoir. It's a kind of a coming of age memoir. It talks about my growing up in New Orleans, in the household of a writer, my father, Tom Sancton Sr., but also, and partly thanks to him, I encountered a group of elderly, from my current perspective, they don't seem so elderly, but when I was 12 years old, they seemed like elderly men. A group of African-American jazz musicians who were active around Preservation Hall. And so when my father took me there as a kid, I was 12 years old or so, and I was just enamored with that music and with these people, these wonderful musicians. I don't know if you can see it here, but this is me at 12 years old playing at Preservation Hall with George Lewis, legendary clarinet.
Everybody has to listen to his music if they're listening.
Yeah, check it out, George Lewis, just extraordinarily sensitive, moving, very, how shall I say, very, a moving clarinet player with just a gorgeous tone. And I was absolutely struck by the sound of his music. And he actually, somebody gave me a clarinet, and I took lessons from him. So that was the beginning of a very unusual adventure at that time. And it was the tail end of the Jim Crow era in the South, and whites and blacks didn't. It was illegal to socialize, but I was really kind of taken into this brotherhood of musicians, and all the other ones were older, much older, and black, and in a lot of ways that was an extraordinary experience. So I also talk about my biological father and his influence on me. So the plural, Song for My Fathers, actually that's taken from the title of a Horace Silver composition that you know well because you're a very good jazz pianist in your own right, Song for My Father. Yeah. So I adapted it, Song for My Fathers. That's my biological father, and my spiritual fathers, who were the musicians who with whom I apprenticed and learned a lot about music, but also a lot about life. So that's what that book is about.
I love this Father's Day theme. I'm glad that you were able to do this, because I think that's, what do you think of the idea of, I mean, there's this concept of dad books, that are books that you just give, like, for some reason, my book has been pegged as one of these. And I have no doubt that your book, the Last Baron, which is about a kidnapping and
Yeah.
in the 70s, will also be pegged as a dad book, which I think is somewhat unfair. But
Yeah.
why do you? I'm very happy if dads want to buy my book and buy it for Father's Day and buy it for every father you know. But still, what do you think of that idea of marketing towards dads?
I think if it sells books, it's great. But, and I'm sure John agrees.
Yeah.
But it's a familiar marketing technique to try to hook a product onto something, some date, some holiday, some pegs. So
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, I mean, I just mean the demographics. Why do older men gravitate towards history?
These are books. Your book is really I don't want to discourage women from reading it because it's a fantastic read, but it's really a book about guys going through this harrowing experience together, and it's like a band of brothers kind of thing. And
Yeah.
so I can see that would appeal to fathers and to kind of somewhat, well, let's say mature male readers because of the subject matter.
Yeah. But yeah,
and I could say the same thing for Song for My Fathers. As far as The Last Baron goes, which will come out next April, it's a little premature to talk too much about it, but it's about this inheritor of an industrial dynasty, the Baron Alpin, who's the third baron in that line, inherited a huge industrial group in Belgium and France, and he, at the peak of his career, when he's only 40 years old, he's suddenly kidnapped.
Yeah.
And as a result of that, I'll just cut to the chase here. As a result of that, he survived, but he lost his group. He lost his family.
Yeah.
It was
it's a really great
terrible thing that happened to him.
Yeah.
That's a book. I don't know if it's a Father's Day kind of book, but the relationship between him and his father and the grandfather was something is a kind of a key theme in that book. But this thinking about writers, father and son writers.
Yeah.
One thing that I think is really interesting about our relationship is that it's really collegial, as writers.
Yeah.
It's
well,
not
yeah, I mean that has to do with your grades, because I think there's no reason, I've always looked up to you. There's no reason for you to, it's usually the father that would feel some kind of, I don't know, territorialism, and you haven't been.
No, but no, I don't feel that at all. I think it's collegial in the sense that we bounce ideas off each other. I read your manuscript through several iterations. You read several manuscripts of books I was working on, and the fact is that because of your editing experience and writing experience at the magazines, you've developed a really professional understanding of the writer's trade, to the point where your advice is valuable to me, not because you're my son, but because you're an experienced wordsmith now.
Yeah, it's almost like we have an author support group now.
Yeah. So that makes you a valuable resource for me, and I guess you've always considered me somebody you could come to for advice about writing, among other things.
Yeah. No, but I think it's fun that we both sort of fallen into this, and not only writing books, but books in the similar vein, with adventure stories and these, well, at least with The Last Baron. But no, it's I don't think I've ever, maybe I haven't gone through my Oedipal crisis yet. 40 years, 40, everybody.
Don't go there. It's if you can avoid that, I'd appreciate it. Personally, I'd appreciate it. Otherwise, you'd have to kill me or destroy me, leave me in your dust, which you seem to be maybe headed towards doing, but which is great. One thing that's interesting is we talk about Leopold II. He's a character in my book, The Last Baron. In fact, he's the one who ennobled the founder of this Empin dynasty. He was a big buddy of Leopold II. So we have Leopold II and Belgium in common between our
Yeah,
two
that's true. Yeah, yeah,
which is
that is
also cool.
that is remarkable. There's a question here from Sarah Doman. Can we hear about the research that Julian did for the book in Antarctica? What types of sources or information were available, and did he winter over to replicate the experience of the Belgica crew? I did go to Antarctica, but I was very happy to rely on the diaries for the wintering over part. Yes, I did travel to Antarctica for a week. I went to the Gerlache Strait, which is where the ship spent 2 weeks exploring in depth. It's an absolutely sublime stretch of the Antarctic Peninsula, one of those beautiful and daunting places on Earth. But I was lucky. I thought that one of the reasons that this had never been written as a book before was that perhaps the historical record was poor. But I was very quickly disabused of that notion, because it turns out that of the 18 men who reached Antarctica, 11 kept some kind of diary. And so this was just a historian's dream. And I was also lucky enough to be allowed access to the Belgica's log. I connected with de Gerlache's descendants, and they gave me access to the log, which was like, I was reading it at their beautiful estate outside Ghent, alongside his great-grandson, who had never read it before, and they were just sort of leafing through every page. I was taking iPhone photos of thousands of pages, and we were just reading this together, almost like reading an adventure book. So that was remarkable. And I also went to the Belgian Museum of Natural Sciences, which is where all the specimens were kept. And scientists pulled out an emperor penguin out of some crate, like in Raiders of the Lost Ark. He pulled out some, and it was just standing there about 4 feet tall, and it was the closest I came to meeting somebody who had been on this expedition. And I told myself that its meat probably saved their lives. So. Yeah, and otherwise I went to archives in Oslo and in Washington, D.C., and in Ohio as well. So it was a globe-trotting research process.
But you also did field research. You went to Antarctica.
I did, yeah, for a week. I went in much more luxurious circumstances. I was sipping martinis in the same waters that only the boldest explorers dared to explore back then. But it is kind of sad to think that this is the Antarctic is only a few $1,000s away from anybody at this point. That anybody who's willing to spend the money can go. But it also, there's no way to travel there without some kind of guilt, because the emissions that are that cruise ships emit are terrible and contributing to the breakdown of this delicate ecosystem. But it also for me was, and for many of the people on my ship, made it clear how important it is to preserve this area. So it is made perhaps a slightly self-serving argument to think that you need to see a land in order to understand its importance, but that it was absolutely clear to all the people there that this is only 120 years after the first people to see it, the men of the Belgica. It's already that was already a lost world 120 years later. It may look the same, but it's breaking down very fast.
Yeah, but for you as a writer, it was also important to see what it looks like.
I had no guilt as a writer. No, I had to see it. In fact, an editor that I respect very much asked me, well, why don't you just rely on the diaries? And I told him, he suspected that I just wanted to write off a trip to Antarctica, but which was partly true, and I did write it off. But it was really that I had to, in order to render this environment, I had to describe it the way, how it looked, how it smelled, how it, the sounds of the wildlife. And I'm so glad I did, because if I were just to to rely on the photographs, which were the first photographs ever taken of Antarctica. If I were just to rely on those, I would have been describing an environment in black and white, as opposed to the enchanting spectrum of blues and yellows and oranges that you see in that environment.
Don't forget the smell of the penguins too. I think
That stuck with me, and in fact, it stuck with somebody, one of my shipmates, who slipped in guano and fell in one of their rookeries, and that clings to you. And we were warned not to approach it, because no matter how much you try to scrub it off, it won't go away. And so he became something of a pariah on our ship.
Win friends and influence people. How not to win friends.
Right. It was. I mean, the cafeteria. There was probably a buffer of about 3 tables around this guy.
There is one last question here. Viewer writes, if you're familiar with the history of Sidney Jeffries, who wintered with Mawson and was considered to have developed severe mental illness during the winter.
I had written about Jeffries in a chapter that was cut, but actually made its way into GQ as an excerpt. Jeffries was Douglas Mawson was an explorer, an Australian explorer whose expedition took place probably about 10 years after the Belgica. He has an incredible story to tell. It's really, you know, it's as impressive as Shackleton, and much less well known. However, one of the men, the radio operator at his expedition, went mad and decided to. He was like one of the men that I described. I mean, people who go mad in the Antarctic, and I listed a whole history of this in the GQ excerpt. They tend to go mad in similar ways. They tend to be obsessed with violence, and maybe that's just the way we understand. You know, non-specialists know what madness looks like, is when people start talking about murder. But these cases tend to have people either fearing murder or threatening it. And Sidney Jeffries was on the latter. It was in the latter category, and he threatened to. He wanted to start duels with everybody, and he would radio the base, accusing the men around him of being mad, and saying that he was the only sane one. It's a really sad story. It's as a writer, it's tough, because these are riveting stories, and you're attracted to them, but you also realize that these are cases of mental illness, and you have to feel sorry for these men. I don't know what happened to Sidney Jeffries after. I'm not sure if he recovered his reason.
Well, we've reached the top of the hour. Julian, Tom Sancton, thank you so much for joining us at Home with Literati. You can, of course, purchase Madhouse at the End of the Earth, which I believe I mistitled at the beginning of the event, and I apologize for.
You're not the course. Don't worry. I'm sure Google will correct that.
And there's links in the chat, and of course, if you're watching this later on YouTube, there are links to purchase books from both authors in the description right below me. Julian, Tom, hope to have you in the store in Ann Arbor sometime in the not too distant future, but until then, hope you continue to stay safe and be well. And to all of our viewers, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We look forward to seeing you at the next event. Have a great night, everybody.
Thanks, John.
Thank you. Good night, Julian.
Happy Father's Day, everyone.
Thank you.